Thank you, Jocelyn, for giving us excellent speech without any PowerPoint. That's not easy. Okay, we should admire that ability. For the benefit of audience, I'll speak in Korean for your question. If you don't get well the translation, I'll speak in English too. Okay? Yeah. Okay. So he touched upon many issues. 저 질문은 일단 한국말로 하겠습니다. 청중을 위해서. 오늘 이제 방금 린 교수가 말했듯이 올해가 이제 중국의 개혁개방 40주년 되는 해이죠. 78년 시작했는데, 그때 당시에 중국이 개혁개방 시작할 때 서방에서, 미국에서 반응이 어떻겠어요? 지금 봐서는 중국이 성공한 것이 아주 당연한 것처럼 느껴지죠. 중국은 나라도 크고 노동도 풍부하고 그러니까. 그런데 그 당시에는 미국 경제학자들, 노벨상 받은 사람 다 중국 실패할 거라 그랬어요. 중국 안 될 거라고. 왜냐? 공산당이라는 권위주의자하고 개혁개방은 맞지 않는다. 그럼 다 실패할 거 예측했어요. 이게 사실은 얼마나 미국에서 계속 말했듯이 어떤 서방식 어떤 경제적 사상이란 것이 개도국이 얼마나 이렇게 적절치 않을 수 있는가 하는 사례가 되는 거예요. 중국 자체가 그 사례인 것 같아요. 그래서 그런 취지에서 몇 가지 질문을 해보겠습니다. 첫 번째는 일단 한국 관점에서 사실 요새 사실은 아직은 중국 1인당 소득이 한국보다 낮지만은 이제는 사람들이 많이 바뀐 것 같아요. 그래서 이제 아까 우리 박 총장께서 얘기했듯이 중국의 어떤 IT에서의 어떤 눈부신 성과 같은 걸 보면은 우리가 지금 혁신 성장하려고 그러는데 잘 안 되고 있단 말이죠. 창업 이런 것도 안 되고. 그래서 현재 중국의 중간촌이라든가 심천의 눈부신 어떤 그런 성장을 보고 참 우리가 감탄하고 있는데, 아직도 한국에서 보기에는 어떤 공산당 어떤 권위적 통제하고 어떻게 이런 혁신이 양립이 가능한가가 사실 아직도 퍼즐인데, 림 교수께서 보시기에는 현재 중국에서 이렇게 많은 새로운 스타트업, 아까 유니콘 같은 것이 나오는 배경, 또는 이것이 얼마나 어떤 자연적인 현상인지 아니면 정부의 어떤 도움이 한 것인지, 이런 것들을 좀 우리 한국에서 현재 젊은이라든가 어떤 한국 정부가 관심 있는 것 같아요. 그래서 어떻게 중국이 이런 많은 혁신적 어떤 창업 기업을 창출하고 있는지, 거기에 대해서 한국 사람들이 듣고 싶어 할 텐데, 그걸 일단 첫 번째 질문으로 던지겠습니다. 유가리, 오케이?
Okay. This is a very good question. And the unicorns in China attract a lot of attention, like Tencent, like Alibaba, and so on. But actually, that's just one part of China. For China, as a middle-income country, I divided China into the industry in China into 5 categories. The first category is some more traditional industry. China has those kind of industry, like equipment, machine building, and so on. But other high-income countries also have those kind of industry, like Germany, Japan, Korea, and so on. China is still on the catching up stages. And then there are second type of industry. China is already the global leaders, or China is very close to the global leaders, like household appliances. The Chinese, TV producers, refrigerator producer, air conditioning producers, are among the best in the whole world, or very close to the best in the whole world. And the third type of industry, China already loses comparative advantages, like the labor-intensive export partial industry. That used to be the main industry in China, but with the rising wages in China, China already lost the comparative advantages. The fourth type of industry, which is your area of research, short cycle industries. The innovation of the technology and the products are very short, and the input mostly in human capital. Certainly, some capital was necessary, but because it's short cycles, so the most important thing is the human capital. And the last one is some kind of strategic industries. either related to the national defense or they are strategically important, and although China does not have comparative advantages in those kind of sectors, but due to the strategic importance, China would also have to develop these kind of industries. And all these, five categories of industries, certainly entrepreneurship is important. But at the same time, government facilitation to overcome the bottleneck would also be important. If I have opportunity, I'll be happy to come to explain more thoroughly about how to support those kind of different type of industry according to the nature of their bottlenecks. Then coming to your question, how come China has so many unicorns? Because unicorns is the short cycle industries. And certainly that is one area China has comparative advantages. And there's more unicorn in China, I think, for several reasons. Because China has 1.4 billion population. That means China has more engineers. China also has more talented people. And if you rely mainly on human capitals, China can compete, not only Korea, China can all compete with the US. Because among the top 50 unicorns last year, 27 were Chinese, 16 were US. And the main reason is because China has more population, China has more genius, China has more engineers. And secondly, China also has large domestic market. Because as you study, for this kind of new technology, new product, standards is very important. And you have a large domestic market. Once you invent those kind of new product, you can immediately reach the large domestic market, and they will allow you to compete internationally. The third one is that also related, China is a large economy. Because if this kind of new innovations require hardwares, China now have the most compressive industrial sectors in the whole world. So once you have the ideas, you can quickly turn it into products. I think that's the main reason about why China has more unicorn in the world compared not only to Korea, but also to US. And for that, actually, to form some kind of free trade arrangement between China, Korea, and Japan would be desirable. Because if you have those kind of free trade arrangement, then the talented people in Korea, once you have some kind of new innovations, you can immediately reach a large market. And that is also the reason why the European Union, they want to form a common market, because that allows each individual country to have one innovation immediately reach the large market. So to answer your question, it's not because of Korean people are less innovative than China. It's only because China has more genius. But if we can improve the market arrangement, we will help more Korean talented people to use their talents and to reach large domestic market. Then you will have a better opportunity to have more unicorns in Korea.
Thank you. 제가 한국 입장에서 중국이 왜 그 혁신적인가 말고 한국이 왜 덜 혁신적인가에 대해서 여러분 아시겠지만 한 말씀 하면은 규제 방식에서 여러분 아시겠지만 이제 포지티브 방식, 네거티브 방식이 있죠. 그래서 포지티브 방식은 이런 거면은 할 수 있다. 그게 한국이고 네거티브는 이런 거 빼고 다 해도 된다라는 거죠. 근데 한국은 정부가 리스트한 거에 없으면 못 하는 거예요. 허가를 못 받는 거예요. 지금 이런 환경이 제일 좀 문제인 것 같고, 또 중국 간에서 재밌는 거는 유니콘이 아까 27개라는데 한 13개, 14개 절반 정도가 항주 출신이에요. 항주. 알리바바 고향 항주죠. 그래서 왜 항주가 더 이렇게 혁신적인가도 사실은 그 관심 있는 연구 주제가 될 것 같습니다. 예. 오케이, 그러면 let's turn to second question. 벌써 또한 한국적 관점에서 관심 있는 것이 지금 아까 박 총장님도 말씀하셨고 그 임 교수 말씀하셨는데 중미 갈등이죠. 예, 그래서 새로운 강대국이 출현하면은 결국 결국 기존 강대국과 부딪힌다는 이 투키디스 함정 이게 많이 논의됐었는데 이제 그 함정 논의가 진짜 현실화되는 것 같아요. 다시 말해 이제 미국과 중국 시장 맞붙기 시작했단 말이죠. 그래서 대표적인 것이 이제 그 보호무역지 무역 갈등인데 지금 논의가 이제 뭐 누가 더 손해 보느냐 아니면 누가 더 오래 버틸 수 있냐 논의 나오죠. 그래서 뭐 미국이 더 타격을 받을 것이다 또는 뭐 중국이 더 타격 받을 것이라 이런 얘기 나오는데 여기에 대해서 윤 교수님 보기에는 어떤지 중국이 잘 할 수 있을 것인지 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
Well, the first one about the tension now mostly in trade, and the reason for the U.S. to adopt some kind of measure against China is because China enjoys a large trade surplus. Last year, it was about 370 billion US dollars, and especially this kind of trade surplus of China increased very rapidly. In 1985 was the first time China to have a trade surplus with the U.S., and that was only 60 million, was only 0.3% of the U.S. trade deficit. Last year, 370 billion, and that was 44% of the U.S. trade deficit. However, we also need to understand what kind of product China export to the U.S. The type of product that China export to the U.S. are mostly labor-intensive processing type of product. And those kind of product actually was not U.S. comparative advantages. And the U.S. gave up those kind of sectors. From after the Second World War, first, at that time, they imported those kind of labor-intensive product from Japan, and the U.S. had trade deficit with Japan. And about the time 1970s, the wage rate in Japan rose up. Those kind of labor-intensive industry shifted from Japan to Korea, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to Singapore, to Thailand, to Malaysia. And the U.S. started to have trade deficit with these East Asian economies. By the time of the 1980s, wage rate also rose in the newly industrialized East Asian economies like Korea and so on. And those kind of industries shift to China. And so U.S. trade deficit shift from the East Asian economy and concentrate in China. And also, although China alone now contribute a lot to U.S. trade deficit, but in the 1980s, more than 100% of the U.S. trade deficit came from East Asia. Today, it reduced down to about 50%. So, although China as a country enjoy large trade surplus, but those kind of trade surplus was a concentration of trade surplus of other East Asian economy to China. And China had trade deficit with Korea, with Taiwan, and so on. And so from that understanding, the trade deficit in China was because of difference in comparative advantages. And the expansion of the U.S. trade deficit was not because of China. It was because of the lack of saving in the U.S. Because East Asian alone actually not contribute to the U.S. trade deficit, reducing from more than 100% down to now about 50%. So under this kind of situation, we know trade should be a win-win for both countries. If U.S. wanted to impose high tariff rate on China, China will be hurt, but U.S. will also be hurt. The main reason is that those kind of products U.S. will not produce anymore. It's unlikely those kind of labor-intensive products will ship back to the U.S. So if U.S. impose a high tariff rate on China, there's two scenarios. U.S. continue to import from China, but consumer would have to pay higher prices for the products. Or U.S. ship the import from China to other countries, like Vietnam and so on. Currently, they could do that, but they did not do that only because if they import from other countries, the cost will be higher. And again, that will not reduce the trade deficit in the US, and the consumer would have to pay higher prices. And not only will deteriorate their living standards, because the disposable income of the consumers are roughly the same. If they pay higher prices for this kind of living necessities, labor-intensive product, they will have less income for other services and products. And in fact, they will also reduce the job in the US. And then certainly China will retaliate. And then China will raise the tariff rate for the import from the US. And that will reduce US import to China. And further, that will reduce the employment in the US. So if there's a trade war, certainly China will be hurt, but US will also be hurt. But China is a large country, so there's some calculation. If there are full-blown trade war, how much reduction of the growth rate in China will be? And how much reduction of the growth rate in the US will be? Some studies show maybe US will reduce 0.3% growth rate. China may reduce 0.5% growth rate, more than US. But as I mentioned, China may grow at 6.5%. To reduce from 6.5% to 6%, certainly China is hurt. But China should be able to endure those kind of shock.
질문하기 전에 제 잠깐 의견을 말씀드리면은 여러분 제가 제기한 질문 다시 말해서 누가 더 손해를 볼 것인가에 대한 임 교수의 답은 뭔지 알으셨죠? 이제 숫자로도 나온 것 같은데 절대 이 숫자는 중국 그 성장률 감소가 많겠지만은 상대적으로 볼 때는 미국한테 크단 말이죠. 이것이 이제 포인트였던 것 같습니다. 근데 한국 입장에서 또 말씀드리면 한국은 지금 사실은 무역으로 먹고 사는 나라라서 지금 GDP 대 무역 비율이 120%의 한국이 세계 최고입니다. 100% 넘었어요. 그래서 한국은 강대국들이 무역전을 하면은 물론 뭐 어떤 사람들은 이제 뭐 미국이 중국에 안 사고 한국 사면은 도움되는 측면도 있다 그러는데 그런 도움되는 측면도 있겠지만은 전반적으로는 우리가 손해 보는 측면이 많기 때문에 한국의 기본 입장은 자유무역주의를 한국은 계속 주창하고 있습니다. 그래서 사실은 지금 상황이 거꾸로 된 것이 사실 미국이 전통적으로 자유무역 주장하는 나라인데 갑자기 이 나라가 보호무역주로 가고 그동안 무역을 보호하던 중국이 지금 자유무역주 보호하는 세계가 지금 거꾸로 된 거죠. 세계가 지금. 사실은 새로 등장하는 강대국이 사실은 자유무역주 주장하게 되어 있습니다. 사실은. 그래서 중국이 자유무역 주장한 것인데 그래서 사실은 중국 자유무역주를 주장하기 위해서 친구가 필요한데 가장 중요한 친구가 사실 한국이에요. 지금 사실은. 자유무역주의를 전파하기 위한 계속 유지하기 위한 하나의 그 나라로서 이런 면에서 중국 한국이 다시 한번 그 좀 협력할 수 있는 상황이 그런 면에서 좀 생긴 것이고 과거에 최근에 어떤 사드로 한 어떤 그 굉장히 어려웠던 관계를 좀 다시 회복하는 계기가 다 이번 세계 무역 전쟁 상황이 또 그런 면에서도 어떤 계기가 되는 것 같고 그 증거가 지난주에 우리나라 그 절을 7개를 뭐 유네스코 등재하는데 중국이 도와줘서 통과됐다는데 아마 이제 그런 사인이 아닌가 싶습니다, 사실은. Okay, now third question. Okay. 또 하나 질문을 이제 제기하면은 역시 또 한국과 관련되는 이야기를 한데 아까 발표하실 때 중국의 고성장의 그 부작용으로서 빈부격차의 증가, 그다음에 부정부패의 증가를 들었는데. 과거의 한국의 경험도 초기에 그 한국이 노동이 과잉되는 상태였을 때, 그 다음에 도시로에 막 인용이 될 때는 진위계 수가 불평등 지표가 증가했어요. 그런데 한국이 이제 경제 성장에 따라서 노동이 부족해지고 임금이 오르니까 70년대 중반부터 이제 분배가 호전되는 소위 말해서 이제 루이스 터닝 포인트, 루이스가 말하는 전환점이 통과되면서 한국이 이제 분배가 다시 호전됐는데 IMF 직전까지 97년 이전까지 그래서 중국도 만약 이런 추세가 맞다면은 그동안 이제 분배가 악화됐지만은 향후에 분배가 호전될 수 있을 거라고 보는지, 아니면 뭐 한국처럼 빨리 그런 시기가 올지 않을 수 있다고 보는지, 여기에 대해서 임 교수님 견해는 어떤지 묻고 있습니다.
Well, I fully agree with you. The income disparity also has related to the stage of development. Because in the early stage of development of China, income disparity was driven by one source was the distortion, as I mentioned. You ask the poor people, subsidize the rich people. And also because of large surplus labor in China. And so the wage rate in China did not increase for more than 20 years, from the 1990s to early, from 1980s to about 2000. The wage rate in real term in China did not increase, but the economy grew. That means the capital owner, they benefit more. But in recent years, income disparity in China started to decline. One thing related to, the risk turning point, because now there's some labor shortage. As a result, the wage rate in China increased much faster than the GDP growth rate. And that contributes to the income, the narrow income disparity. But also the government introduces more social programs to provide the benefit to the poor family, protection to the workers, that further reduce the income disparity. So I think that China will follow the pattern in Korea. First rising income disparity, then declining income disparities.
I hope it's true. Okay. 그러면 마지막으로 제가 하나 질문하고 여기 청중에서 온 질문들을 림 교수에게 전달하도록 하겠습니다. 제가 하고 싶은 마지막 질문은 오늘 발표에서는 별로 안 나왔지만은 중국이 그 리스크 문제인데요. 중국이 정부 부채는 아마 GDP 60%로서 뭐 굉장히 좋은 아주 낮은 수준인데 기업의 부채가 지금 170%가 넘어서 굉장히 다른 나라에 비해서 높은 수준이고, 왜 이걸 묻냐면은 과거 한국이 97년에 외환위기 당할 때 그때 바로 기업 부채가 많은 것이 하나의 약점이었는데 중국도 그런 면에서 이 기업 부채 문제를 어떻게 해소하려고 하는지, 그다음에 중국의 어떤 그런 위기 상황 어떤 가능성에 있어서 기업 부채가 어떤 그 부담이 되는지 앞으로 전망 이런 것들을 묻고 싶습니다.
Well, the high corporate debts certainly is an issue we need to pay attention to. But I think that, if we are not trigger an immediate crisis, as what happened in 1997 in Korea. One reason, all the corporate debts in China are in Chinese currency. And we know that corporate debts can become a crisis if the debt is in foreign currencies. When the debt is in foreign currencies, you're going to encounter, the term mismatch issue and currency mismatch issues. So during the economic recessions, then you may not be able to repay the debt and turn it into currency crisis. But China, all the debt are in the Chinese currencies. So there's no such pressure. And also many of those debt were bottled by the state-owned enterprises. And they were guaranteed by the government. And there's good reason for the government to guarantee them. Because after the reform, before the reform, all the capital investment in the state-owned enterprises came from the fiscal appropriation, from the government budget. But after 1983, the government would not provide capital at all. And so for the state-owned enterprises, their expansion depends on two sources. One is their own earnings. The other one is from the bank loans. And I think that's the reason why the state-owned enterprises, they have a very high leverage because they rely on borrowing to get the capitals. But those kind of borrowing were insured or guaranteed by the state. So due to these two considerations, I think a high corporate debt in China will not trigger, crisis. It may slow down the growth, but I don't think that will turn into a currency crisis as we observed in 1998 in Korea or 2008. You almost have another crisis because of big corporate debt denominated in foreign currencies.
Thank you, thank you. 네, 그 방금 대답했듯이 그 한국과 다른 점은 한국이 90년대 그 기업 부채 많은 거는 도메스틱 부채가 아니라 많은 그것이 그 한국보다 이자율이 싼 홍콩 등 해외에서 갖다 빌려온 외환 부채입니다. 외환 부채. 그래서 달러로 빚을 가져왔다가 한국의 국내 사업에 투자했기 때문에 그것이 바로 이제 통화 미스매치 때문에 한국이 당했던 것이 사실인데 중국은 그렇지 않다는 면에서 부채 비율은 숫자는 높지만은 그것이 외환위로 갈 가능성이 낮다는 이런 답변이 있던 것 같습니다. So I have to now turn to so many questions, Lin. So many questions for us. You cannot go to home. You have to go to airport, take a flight right up to this. So I'll pick up only a couple of them. Okay. 자, 그러면 여러분 질문 너무 많이 해주셨는데 우선 다 할 수는 없을 것 같고 일부는 방금 저희 대화 속에 좀 나왔던 거라서 몇 가지 일단 하면은 첫 번째 질문이 그 중국 경제의 어떤 부상 또 중국의 어떤 그 대국의 성장에 대해서 미국 등 일부 국가에서는 이것을 중국이 이 패권적인 어떤 그 야망에 의한 것이다. 그래서 이걸 이제 그런 중국의 강대국화를 어떤 경계하는 생각이 있는데 그런 어떤 거에 대해서 링규 생각은 어떻게 보시는지 그런 견제론에 대해서.
Well, some people always like to use their own behavior to project the other people's, because they become hegemony, and when they become strong, and so when they see other country become strong, they immediately think they will be fair like us. But I think that China has a different culture, right? We have Confucianism cultures. And Confucianism cultures, we like to live in harmony, and we like to help each others. When we become rich, we hope other countries will become rich. Well, certainly that will mean China will have to increasingly play a more proactive role in the world, but to play a more proactive role in the role is not for the purpose of dominating other countries, but for the purpose of that we enjoy the prosperity together. So I cannot, stop other people to use their own image to predict other countries. But I think we know what we are trying to do. We hope that we can live in a harmony. We hope China will be, become prosperous, but we also like other countries to become prosperous. That is the idea of Zen, meaning that we like to, be sympathetic to each other, and in needs we like to help each other.
Thank you. 방금 질문이 굉장히 좀 이렇게 일단 역시 그 아주경제 기자분께 질문하셨네. 방금 질문이야. 오케이. 여기 김다경 씨 에모리 대학 질문을 전달하겠습니다. 이 질문은 아까 딱 관련되는 주제인데 중국의 경제 성장을 예측하는 데 있어서 임 교수께서 짚지 않은 부분이 이제 중국에서 원차일드 폴리시가 이제는 끝났고 이제 허용하고 있는데 자식을 많이 낳는 거를 이것이 효과가 어떻게 되고 이것이 중국의 어떤 인구 증가 그다음에 결국 경제 성장에 어떤 영향을 줄 것인가. 근데 관련된 포인트가 중국이 기술 혁신을 하면은 기술 혁신이 일자리를 없어갈 텐데 이 부분에 대해서는 어떻게 생각하는지. So you're asking one-China policy and the impact of innovation on replacing jobs. Yeah? Okay.
Well, because very effective one-child policies and China faced the aging problem before China become rich. In general, aging problem is an issue in high-income economies, like in Japan, like in Korea. Because when people become rich, they don't want to have so many children, and accumulatively, after half a generation, you're going to have the issue of aging. But China encountered the problem much earlier. And so China needs to adapt the policies to encourage the young people, young couple, to have more children. But as you know, when people become rich, it's very hard, even you provide incentive. So that's a challenge in China. But whether these challenges will reduce the growth potential, as I predict, about 6.5% growth in the coming years, in the coming decades. I think it may not, for several reasons. The first one, China currently has an extremely early retirement age. For the female workers, they retire at the age of 50s. Male workers, they retire at the age of 55. And aging means you have less working populations. But China can extend the retirement age to offset that. That's one thing. And secondly, what counts is not the number of workers. What counts is the quality of the workers, the labor force, mean human capitals. So China can invest in education to enhance the human capitals and to offset the decline in the working population. And China has done a lot on that. In 2000, the tertiary graduate each year was less than 1 million. Last year, the tertiary graduate in China was 8.3 million. So I think the improvement in human capitals can overcompensate the decline in the number of workers. And that contributes to the phenomena you described about the unicorns. Most of the unicorns are by young people, and they are educated. And the education in China paved the foundation for them to be able to be innovative. So for that, I think that is one issue, again, that we need to cope with, but I don't think it will be a main binding constraint for the sustainability of China's growth.
두 분 질문을 결합해서 전달하겠습니다. 하나는 전윤석 분이고 하나는 진숙이라고 쓰신 분인데 두 질문이 아마 이제 차나 모델, 중국의 발전 모델과 한국 모델 또는 기타 동아시아 모델과의 차이 또는 비슷한 점이 뭔가라는 질문이었고 좀 더 구체적으로 이런 중국 모델을 다른 나라에 할 수 있는가? 중국은 나라 크기 때문에 서방이 하라는 대로 안 하고 독자적으로 할 수 있었던 것 같은데 다른 작은 나라들은 서방의 말을 따라야 되기 때문에 중국식 모델을 할 수 없지 않는가 이런 그 포인트를 전달해 드리겠습니다.
Well, that depends on how we understand what is the main spirit of China's success. What's the main spirit of Korean success? And there's one way to summarize China's success, or because of the political system in China. Then that is not applicable to other countries, because you cannot ask other countries to have a communist party like China, right? So if we summarize, generate the lesson in that way, then the China's experiences is not applicable to other countries. However, if you look into the success of East Asia, I think that's something in common. One thing, they all develop industries according to what I say, their competitive advantages. In early stage of development, they all rely on labor-intensive processing industry. Korea, developed that way, Taiwan that way, Singapore that way, and mainland China in the 1980s, 1990s also developed the labor-intensive industry, and to transform the rural surplus labor into the workforce in the modern industry. And with that success, they accumulate capital, they upgrade to more capital-intensive, technology-intensive industry. So step by step, according to the comparative advantages in each stage of development. That's one thing. But if we want to develop industry consistent with the comparative advantages, then we need to have a market economy to provide the price signals for the entrepreneur to adopt those kind of technology and go into the industry which can utilize your abundant supply of factory production that is labor. And then gradually, when labor become more scarce, which already rose, then you will also need to provide incentive and a signal for the entrepreneur to go into more capital-intensive industry, adopt more capital-intensive technology. And you need to have market to provide those kind of signals. And secondly, in the process of industrial upgrading, you also have proactive government to create the policy environment for the entrepreneur, and also to help the entrepreneur to overcome some kind of bottleneck in infrastructure, in finance, and so on. So if we summarize in this way, successful countries, they always develop industries according to what they have, and turn what they have into what they can do well and scale up what they do well in a market economy with proactive government. If you summarize it in this way, then other countries can follow. And in the last few years, I heavily involved in provide this kind of policy framework in other African countries or Middle East country. And I find, if they turn in this way into what they have first, what are their abundant supply first, those to identify sectors which they have comparative advantages, that means what they can do well, and with the government facilitation to turn what they can do well into a competitive sectors. Then those kind of experiences should be applicable to other countries.
Thank you. 몇 분들께서 한국 경제에 대한 어떤 조언을 하는 질문이 있었습니다. 그래서 역시 또 매일경제 김유진 기자님하고 콜ум비아 대학의 박범준 두 개를 묶어서 질문하면은 임 교수님의 발표는 주로 이제 그 개도국 또는 저소득국 또는 중간소득국의 입장인데 한국은 이제 그걸 넘어서 이제 고소득국인데 성장이 지금 정체되고 있단 말이죠. 그래서 그동안에 빠른 추격국이 끝나고 정체를 맡고 있어서 많은 문제입니다. 그래서 미국과 비교해도 한국의 성장률이 미국보다 낮을 것 같아요. 지금 잘못하다간. 그다음에 또 한국이 항상 개도국일 때 이자리 높고 미국이 낮은데 거꾸로 미국이 높고 한국이 낮은 미국과 몇 개의 역전 현상이 날 것 같은데 그런 입장에서 한국 경제에 대한 어떤 성장 정체를 극복할 수 있는 조언을 준다면 어떤 것이 있을까라는 거 하고 좀 더 구체적으로는 최근에 이제 작년에 집권한 문재인 정부가 한 정책 중에 하나가 인컴 베이스 그로스 소득 주도 성장인데요. 그 정책 중에 하나가 미니멈 웨이지 최저임금을 높이는 거였단 말이죠. 그래서 근데 이런 정책에 대해서 이제 논란이 많은데 있는 교수가 보기에는 이런 그 인컴 베이스 또는 최저임금 올리는 정책이 정책에서 어떻게 평가하시는지에 대한 의견을 묻고 싶습니다.
Well, I think I'm not in a very good position to answer this very specific question about Korea. And if the Korean Foundation of Advanced Studies would like to provide some kind of project, I'll be happy to join hand with Professor Kun Lee to do a research to answer these two very important questions. overall, without any studies, I think Korea still has the potential to grow faster than the US economies. The main reason is that US per capita GDP now is about $60,000 US. Korean GDP is about $30,000 US. So your per capita GDP is about 1/2 of the US per capita GDP. If you adjust for purchasing power parities, your per capita GDP is about 70% of the US. There's still 30% to catch up. And there are some areas, I think Korea is still on the catching up stage. And the catching up stages, as I just described, that you can benefit from the latecomers' advantages. And secondly, certainly there are some areas which you are growing the global frontiers. And when you are on the global frontiers, I think that on the one hand, you need to have the entrepreneurship, and on the other hand, the government should help to overcome the bottleneck for the entrepreneurial to be innovative in the sector that they operate. And if you combine those kind of two possibilities, I think that the average annual growth rate in the US was about 3% to 3.5%. And it should be possible for the Korea to be around 4%. Certainly, it will be hard for Korea to grow at 7 or 8% anymore. But I think for Korea to grow at 4% to 5%, from my hunch feeling, I think it's still possible. If we have the right policy framework and to support the entrepreneurship in Korea.
Korean government should invite you via minister or something. Okay, another question. 홍콩 대학의 임석린 질문인데, written in English. I'll read in English and you try to answer. Okay, listen in English. Okay. There is an article or paper by European Center for International Political Economy, ECIP, expressed its pessimistic view on China's economic growth. In the article titled "China in the Global Economy," subtitle is "Leaping Dragon or Paper Tigers." Okay. So they pointed out several limitations as follows. First, China's towering debt mountain. We already discussed that. Okay. Second, money is going into asset bubble in some market in China. Third, low contribution of consumption to GDP. Fourth, China's ability to achieve future economic development by AIB seems to be going well as planned. Okay, with a smaller amount of money available, and some stagnant monetary transaction of renminbi never exceed 3%. So these are the possible critical remarks. What is your defense against this argument?
I did not get the question at the beginning. So could you repeat the question again?
There is an article by European Center for International something, and they said they point 4 limitation, critical point about China.
Yeah.
One is the increasing debt.
Yeah.
Second, asset bubble, financial bubble, something like that. And AIB seems to be doing well in terms of only small amount of money available, something like that, and the low contribution of consumption to GDP.
Okay.
Yeah, those things. Okay.
Well, as I mentioned in my talk at the beginning, in the past 40 years, we repeatedly hear the coming collapse of China's economy. And due to China did not follow the standard theory, where China behaved different from the developed countries. But the issue that China did not collapse. And the country followed the standard theory, where the model in high-income country in general they perform very poorly. And so there's a lot of things to reflect. For example, among these 4 criticisms, the first one about high debt, already mentioned that the debt in China is different from the debt in other countries. One thing, all those debt denominated in the Chinese currency. Secondly, a lot of debt were used for investment instead of used for consumption. So we need to distinguish these 2 types of debt. The debt for investment, you have an asset. So the net debt is much smaller. But the debt for consumption, that can be a real debt. But they did not pay attention to this kind of difference, domestic currency or foreign currency, investment or consumption. And regarding, say, the consumption in China as a percentage of GDP is too low, and actually I do not agree with this kind of argument. Because consumption certainly is important. But if you want to raise the consumption, you need to raise labor productivity in order to raise income. Otherwise, if consumption increases, households will be indebted. And if their income would not increase, then it will turn into crisis for the household. But if you have too many households in that way, it will turn into a crisis for the nation, right? So if you want to increase consumption, first you need to increase labor productivity in order to increase the income. But if you want to raise labor productivity, you need to have a technological innovation in the existing sectors and to have industrial upgrading to higher value-added sectors. No matter technological innovation in the existing sectors or industrial upgrading, all require investment. So if they say the investment in China need to be improved to enhance the efficiency, then I agree. But if they say that China need to change from investment growth model to consumption growth model, I would say this person either do not understand economics or try to trick China into a wrong models. Because we know that in general, a financial crisis in a country was triggered by too much consumption instead of too much investment. So I don't know which category he belongs to. Does he in the economist or he tried to trick China into a wrong model?
마지막 남은 질문은 정치 제도에 관한 것입니다. 좀 민감할 수 있는데 서강대 김동현, 그다음에 한중기업연구소의 강준씨 질문을 엮어서 마지막 질문으로 하겠습니다. 질문 내용은 중국이 정치 제도가 가지는 경제 운영 면에 있어서의 장점과 단점은 뭐라고 생각하시는지 비슷하게 관련돼서 중국이 이 권위주의적 정치 체제의 한계를 극복하고 계속 성장할 수 있을 것인지, 결국 이제 정치 체제하고 경제적 성과 또는 경제 운용과의 관계를 묻는 질문인 것 같습니다. 네.
Well, certainly institution is necessary, and an institution matters. But from the result in the past 40 years, it indicates the institution in China works. Otherwise, you cannot see a country to sustain the growth for such a long time without encountering crisis. And different standard of the people improve dramatically in the past 40 years. Certainly, with the rise of income, the institution needs to, make some changes in order to meet the demand of the people. And that's the reason why President Xi Jinping said now China entering into a new era. When in a new era, the income of people rises, their demand will also changes. People would like to have more quality of life instead of just the quantity of life. Not only to have an income, they want to have a better environment, they want to have better security, and also they will have to have more freedom and so on. And certainly the economic system and the political system need to adapt according to the changing demand of the people. But fundamentally, that the system evolution has some kind of path dependence. It's not necessarily will be a system like, in the West. And, but at the same time, we did not see a developing country to adopt the Western system to perform well. One comparison between China and India was a very good comparison. Because India inherited all the Western modern institutions, like the free press, multi-party system, constitution, democracy. In 1978, the per capita GDP in India was 25% higher than China in 1978. And at that time, I think all the people predict India will continue to perform much better than China because India already has all the right institutions, right? But currently, per capita GDP in China, in India was only 20% of China's per capita GDP. They has all the right institutions as recommended in a textbook. But their per capita GDP changed from 20%, 25% higher than China. Now it's only 20%. So that is also something we need to reflect. Because most scholars in the developing country were taught by the theory that developed in the high-income country. And those kind of theory discuss what is important for the high-income country. And then the scholar in the developing country were mistakenly guided by what was important in the high-income country as what is crucial for the developing country. And try to adopt those kind of theory. Intention certainly is good. Many people sacrifice for that intention. But the result to the country sometimes were very disappointing. So in recent years, I try to advocate something different. In the past, we always look at what the high-income country have and advise the developing country to own what the high-income country have. For example, structuralism. High-income country has modern advanced industry, certainly desirable, and then advise the developing country to set up those kind of modern advanced industry. The result was very poor. And then, in the 1980s, the neoliberalism looked into what the high-income country have at that time, what they can do well. Modern, well-functioning market institutions. And if you look into a developing country, certainly they did not do well in those areas. So they advised the developing country to behave like the advanced country and introduce all those modern institutions like in the advanced country. But developing country followed that. In general, their economy collapsed, stagnant, their gap with the high-income country further widening. And in the past, half a century, we find the successful developing country, in general, what they did were considered as wrong by the theory in the advanced country. I mentioned in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan developed those kind of more traditional labor-intensive industries. And instead of import substitution, they adopt export promotion. Those kind of approach was considered as a wrong approach. And in the 1990s, during the transition, China adopted the gradual dual-track approach. And that approach was considered the worst possible approach. And so we really need to reflect about what really make a developing country to be successful. And I'd like to propose just the opposite. In the past, we always use high-income country as a reference to look at what they have, what they can do well. I think it's time for us to look at what we have. Based on what we have, what we can do well. and create a condition to scale up what we can do well. By that, we don't have to be frustrated all the time. By that, we may have the opportunity to close the gap with the high-income country, and one day we become advanced country.
Thank you. 예. 린 교수가 이제 공항에 가서 떠나야 되기 때문에 제가 마지막 코멘트하고 마치도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 잘 들었듯이 린 교수의 입장 일관되게 우리가 그 서방적인 시각 이론에서부터 자유로워져서 먼저 각자의 나라에 기반한 이론과 시각을 갖는 것이 중요하다는 것이고, 특히 중국을 볼 때 그런 것 같아요. 중국에서 워낙 그 서방적 시각이 많아가지고 거기에 대해서 어떤 독자적 시각을 갖는 게 필요한 것 같고, 그렇게 보면 한국에서의 중국을 보는 시각이 오히려 우위가 있어요. 다시 말해서 한국은 비슷한 성장 경험을 겪었기 때문에 미국이라든가 서방이 보지 못하는 시각 또는 측면에서 중국을 보고 있단 말이죠. 사실은 그런 면에서 한국에서의 중국학 연구가 사실은 독자적인 비교가 있습니다. 우리들 보면 훨씬 더 잘 보이는 측면, 다른 측면을 미국이나 서방 학자들은 놓치고 있단 말이죠. 그래서 그 하나 예를 들면은 경제 성장하기 위해서 어떻게 되냐, 농담 비슷하게 사람들을 많이 감옥에 보내면 된다 그래요. 어떤 사람이. 왜냐? 소득이 높은 나라일수록 감옥에 갇힌 사람이 굉장히 높아요. 미국이 가장 높습니다. 아프리카 가면 감옥에 있는 사람 없어요. 감옥도 보낼 행정 능력이 없단 말이죠. 그래서 무조건 서방적인 어떤 스탠다드를 가지고 거기에 일부러 맞추는 이런 시각의 어떤 정책 또는 처방을 우리가 지양해야 된다는 것이 아마 큰 오늘의 메시지 하나인 것 같습니다. 네. 그리고 인도에 관한 답변은 여기 고대 김대영 스님이 질문하시는데 내가 전달을 못했는데 마침 답변 중에 나와서 다 답변이 된 것 같습니다. 이상으로 오늘 강연과 대담을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 땡큐.
이것으로 강연을 마치겠습니다.